Welcome. In this video, we're going to be looking at a brief introduction to Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's The Hound of the Baskervilles, and in doing so, we're going to study the most famous story by the world's most famous detective, Sherlock Holmes. So it's not always the most fruitful thing to study an author in order to better understand a book, but I think in this instance, knowing a little bit about Arthur Conan Doyle is very useful for the study of Hound of the Baskervilles and Sherlock Holmes in general. Doyle was a medical student in Edinburgh, Scotland, when he found inspiration for the character. One of his professors in medical school was famous for being able to use his skills of observation when it came to diagnosing patients, and Doyle thought, I wonder if a detective or a police officer were to use those same sort of skills. Now, I know what you might be thinking. You might be thinking, well, haven't police always used those skills? Not really. The scientific, deductive, evidence-based reasoning in police and detective work is relatively new, and Doyle is one of the people who kind of helped pioneer it. Before this, police, at least in London, mostly relied on eyewitness accounts or seeing a crime actually happen, and occasionally just picking someone and tossing them down the stairs until they confess to it. So, not good police work. But Doyle, through his character Sherlock Holmes, helps initiate a change for the better. A couple other important notes about Doyle is that he wasn't actually the most interested in writing Sherlock Holmes, at least not exclusively. In fact, he wanted to write what he called serious fiction, mostly historical fiction, and other areas of interest show up in his early stories. The first Sherlock Holmes novel, A Study in Scarlet, is really bogged down by quite a lengthy section set in the Mormon desert, and most scholars and readers, myself included, agree that that is probably the weak point of the novel. One of the things that makes Hound of the Baskervilles so great is that it's exclusively focused on Sherlock Holmes and his adventures. Oh, and one more note on Doyle, he's really into seances and spiritualism, which you only need to get a couple chapters into Hound of the Baskervilles to see how that could be somewhat significant in terms of the lore of the world he's creating here. Okay, so moving on from the author to the protagonist, every Sherlock Holmes story is told through his flatmate, Watson. And while just about everyone who has ever heard of Sherlock Holmes knows he's smart and uses his brain to solve crimes, most readers are surprised to learn that Sherlock Holmes also has a lot of other pretty cool skills besides his intellect, one of which is his ability in Bartitsu. Bartitsu is a Victorian martial art that got really popularized from the most recent Sherlock Holmes movies starring Robert Downey Jr. Basically, it was a way for English gentlemen to protect themselves, and it combined jiu-jitsu with bare-knuckle boxing and cane fighting. And on a weird personal side note, I actually attended the World Conference for Bartitsu Fighting a couple years ago when I was in a play, and our combat style was set in the Bartitsu tradition, so we got to go to the World Expo, which did not have that many people in it, but a lot of them were like MMA fighters who were also into history and stuff, and they weren't super impressed with my fighting ability, but I got a lot of compliments on how bendable my arms were. Apparently that's a skill. Another important thing to know when it comes to The Hound of the Baskervilles is some of the stories leading up to it. It is not the first Sherlock Holmes story, not by a long shot. In fact, if Doyle's original plan had gone as he thought it would, it probably wouldn't be a story at all. You see, Sherlock Holmes has an arch-villain, Professor Moriarty. And Moriarty is not in this novel. There is a character named Dr. Mortimer that the first time I read this when I was in like 9th grade, I confused the two, but Mortimer is not his arch-villain. Moriarty is. And basically, Moriarty and Sherlock Holmes get in a fight in one of the most famous Sherlock Holmes short stories, The Final Problem. And in case you're interested in reading it, I'm not going to spoil it for you. But by the end of it, you're supposed to kind of be done with Sherlock Holmes. It was Doyle's farewell to the character. Or so he thought. You see, Sherlock Holmes was pretty much the most popular literary figure since ever in England, so there was an incredibly large amount of demand for Doyle to return to Sherlock Holmes, even though he wanted to go back to his bad, serious historical fiction. He got a lot of monetary offers, he got letters constantly, some of which even came from supposedly some members of royalty. Anyway, he decides to pull a Star Wars prequel and move Sherlock back in time so he can kind of still keep his timeline, although he'll break his timeline later on anyway. But when he finally brings Sherlock Holmes back, he brings him back with the Hound of the Baskervilles. So the anticipation of this novel is incredible by the time it finally comes out. And it's no wonder that it takes off. But even without that sort of backstory there, the novel really holds up on its own. If it's the first Sherlock Holmes you've ever read, you'll find yourself getting into it right away. One of the key things to think about when reading The Hound of the Baskervilles is the setting. Some of the story takes place in London, where most Sherlock Holmes stories take place, but a majority of it is actually in Devonshire, England. Even to this day, this is a rather remote corner of England, and it's famous for a geographical feature known as the moors. And the moors are these really swampy, but they don't necessarily look swampy like how you'd think like the Everglades swampy. They kind of look just like a normal field, grass, turf sort of thing, but they can be really deceptive. Animals can get trapped in the moors. They're very, very dangerous. When the wind picks up in the moors, there's usually a howling noise, so it's really kind of a desolate, creepy area, and to this day, it's kind of spooky. And it's a perfect setting for Doyle's story, this old mansion surrounded by the moors. So if you're not familiar with England topography, then it might be useful to look up a little bit about the moors in order to kind of have a better picture of where the novel takes place. And finally, a couple interesting themes of the novel. So the first theme I want to talk about is violence. There's a lot of violence in this novel. We sometimes think of Sherlock Holmes as kind of like just fun and maybe just kind of laid back reading, but the stakes are pretty high here. And there's actually a lot of violence toward women, not exclusively toward women, but maybe more than you're expecting. Now, that's not necessarily atypical. Women are often victims in stories, especially stories told by men, if we're honest here. But I think if you had to write a paper about this book, you could find something there, the connection between women, female characters, and violence. Another really interesting aspect of this story is the idea of temptation and sin and repercussions for that. Many of the characters in this story are faced with punishment for their actions. Now, as you read, you can decide if it's supernatural, spiritual, or just justice writing itself in the universe. But either way, the idea of temptation, sin, and punishment for that sin is alive and well. In fact, in some ways, you could even see the moors as a representation of hell or purgatory. So that's another interesting angle you can take. The last thing I want you to think about with this novel is that it's a mystery, and you should really lean into that genre. There are a lot of what are called red herrings. Red herrings are false clues, and they're designed to throw you off, and they're also designed to be fun. You're not supposed to understand everything as you read this novel, so don't get frustrated if you don't. Just try and enjoy the adventure through Watson and Sherlock's eyes. It's a wonderful, incredible adventure that's really stood the test of time, and I hope you love your reading of this novel. Perhaps we'll talk more about it in the future. Until then, happy reading. See you next time.